Our topic now, as we left before the break, is we're up to here. Know what's in front of us, that great last empire. We want to know, how near is this? Now, I told you last night that I will not give you a date, I won't give you a time, but I will give you what the Bible says about it, because that's all we're sort of looking at. It's a prophecy masterclass. So what does the Bible say on these things? To set the context, let's go back, which seems like a millennium ago, to the year 2020. Do you remember that year? I said, do you remember 2020? Yeah, we've all tried to forget it, haven't we? So 2020 began, from an Australian perspective, it began, I'm just trying to get a click, here we go. It began with bushfires. Do you remember the bushfires? They said it was the worst season on record. End of December 2019 to January 2020. It was horrendous what was happening. But then, what eclipsed that was this thing. Dare I say the word, for fear of triggering some of us? But then almost immediately as this thing started unwinding, what we started to see was people stockpiling toilet paper. I remember I was actually doing a presentation the day before they closed the border to Tasmania, where I was working at the time, and I was making a joke to the congregation saying, "Did you all get your toilet paper?" They're all laughing and that stuff. Anyway, 2 days later, they shut all the borders. I was like, wow, this thing's getting serious. At the same time, we saw mass unemployment. In our lifetime, well, at least my lifetime, some of you are older than me, but some of you are younger, but in our lifetimes, we haven't seen this sort of thing in Australia. Mass unemployment, people going to Centrelink to get on their payments. But at the same time, in Africa, at the exact same sort of month, they called it biblical proportion plagues of locusts. It seemed like the world went crazy in just a few months. But at the same time, in the US, they had one of their worst tornado seasons on record. And then, at the same time, global inflation started to become a thing people were getting worried about. But now we come down to a bit closer, 2023, and it was a shock. We woke up one morning, we were worried about how far we had to keep from each other's distances, and next thing we realized that there's a war broken out in Europe. And then, just a year or so later after that, a war breaks out in Israel, both of which are still, as you are very well aware, still being fought at this moment. It seems like our world is falling to pieces in our generation. You see, there's always been these things, but it seems like over the course of history there's been an earthquake. Some time goes by. There's a famine. Time goes by. There's tornado. Time goes by. But it feels like we're being bombarded with more things more often. In fact, since the turn of the millennium, it's become a topic of much interest even in secular material. Time magazine, right at the turn of the millennia in 2000, they said the end of the world, Y2K insanity, and how people are freaking out about the Bible's predictions. And then 2012, it was the Mayan calendar. I mean, we're just being bombarded with this idea that something big and bad is happening. There's a very famous scholar, Professor Bernard, and from the University of Chicago, and he states that over the past 30 years, more scholarship, that means more study, has been devoted to apocalypticism, which is last day events. So what he's saying is, in the academic world, there's been more study about the study of the end of the world in the last 30 years than there has been in the last 300 years. There's a lot of interest in this area. In fact, this author, Eugene Linden, he wrote a book in the early 2000s that said, "The Future in Plain Sight." Now, he is not a religious person, but if you read the subtitle there, it says 9 clues to the coming instability. And in the book, he outlines what he thinks are the signs that we're coming to some big end. And he's not a religious person. This is purely from a secular perspective. Here's some of the things he lists. He says the collapse of the global economy. Now, we looked at that last night, didn't we? The possibility of that. He says the migration of the poor to the cities. These are all signs that we're in danger of the future not looking so bright. Population explosion from urban and rural. Global warming and economic disparity between the rich and the poor. And he goes on in his book and talks about, hey, something's happening. Our world's not going to, it's like it's hanging at the edges. You all have probably heard of Dr. Stephen Hawking at some point. He's passed away now. But he was considered, before he passed away, as one of the brightest minds on the planet. I want you to notice what he said in the context of the problem the world is facing. He says, I fear that since the evolutionary process has worked through the dialectic of determinism and aggression, our long-term survival and any hope of our species is what? This is supposed to be the smartest man of our era. This is our, Einstein, our Newton. And he says, I'm worried about our survival as a species. And this is what he says. He says, however, if we can keep from destroying each other for the next 100 years, sufficient technology will have been developed to distribute humanity to various what? This is the solution from the brightest man of our time. The only solution we have is that we get off this rock just enough time to keep ourselves alive and not kill each other and wipe each other out, to get out of this place and settle on other planets. That's the solution. Now, I don't say this to mock the man, but if that's his solution, we're in trouble. And so what we're going to do now, this is from a secular perspective, we're going to go back to this black book and see what this book says about the time from where we are to the last empire. We go back to the city of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, approximately. And we find there in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago a man called Jesus. They called him the Christ. Christ is a title, not a last name. And Christ means the chosen one, the anointed one. In Hebrew, it's literally Messiah. Jesus was just his normal name, which happens to mean Savior. It's the same as Joshua. Joshua means Savior as well. And there's this man, and by the way, I used to think that it was a myth, that Jesus Christ's story was a myth. Now, you may not believe the Christ part, that he's the divine Son of God, the Messiah. But I used to believe that the person was a myth. There was no evidence for this man, Jesus Christ, as existing, literally walking in the dusty streets of Palestine. But here's the thing. That comes from a place of ignorance. You see, there are numerous evidences outside of the Bible for the existence of a historical person called Jesus who lived at the exact time that this book records and walked in the same places that this book records. And we have that evidence. In fact, we have more evidence for the historical person of Jesus than we do for some of the Caesars. For example, Caesar Tiberius. We have less documented evidence for his existence than we do for the person of Jesus. And we'll uncover that, I think it's tomorrow night. We'll look at that in a bit more detail. So in 31 AD, this historical person, this Jesus, this rabbi, is sitting on a mountain, a Mount of Olives it's called, and he's there with his disciples, and his disciples ask him a question, and their question is, tell us, you'll see here if the slide comes up, I might have to change this because this one seems to be causing me dramas. Let's try this one. Okay, let's try. There we go. His followers turn to him and say, hey, Jesus, tell us, when will these things be? And you say, what things? Jesus had been walking through the temple in Jerusalem that King Herod had refurbished, and the disciples are saying, look how great this temple is. See, they were all hoping that this Messiah, this Jesus guy, would take control of the temple and then take control of Rome, and will kick out the Romans at least. And Jesus turned to them and said, see this temple? Not one stone that you see here will be left standing on itself. It's going to all come to a complete destruction and an end. Now, the disciples were confused, but being good disciples, they didn't want to look confused, so they waited till they walked out of Jerusalem, got to the top of the mountain, looking back over the city, and when everyone was gone, they said, tell us, when will these things be? And then they followed up with, and what will be the sign of your what? Coming and the end of the world. This is the question that these disciples threw at this rabbi, because surely if the temple is going to be destroyed, it must be the end in their mind. And so what Jesus does is something fascinating. In his explanation, he takes two events and he overlays them and gives them signs to describe how they're both going to unfold. One is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and one is the end of the world. And he does it. It's called dual layer prophecies and predictions. But in the context of answering this question, what he does is something profound. He gives us a framework to work within as we look at the answer that he gives. Here's the first. There's two parts to this framework. The first one is, he says, listen, I'm going to give you some signs to help you understand how near this end of the world and my return will be. Okay, I'm going to give you some signs. But he says, here in Matthew 24, verse 8, he says, these signs are the beginning of birth pains or labor pains. Now, you ladies in the room who have gone through the wonderful miracle of giving birth, and I say that because I don't have to do it, you will know that there's certain characteristics of birth pains or labor pains. Am I right or am I wrong? Okay, and let's explain that in a second. That's the first framework. We'll come back to that in just a second. That's the first framework. Here's the second framework. So the first one's labor pains. The second one is, Jesus says this. He says, learn the parable from the fig tree. And he's talking about, you'll see the leaves, and you'll see the flowers, and then you'll see the buds, and then you see the fruit, and then you see the harvest. There's two things in these two frameworks that when you overlay them, there are three characteristics that are similar. Here they are. The first is that they are visible. So labor pains become visible. You see it. We had to drive, I think it was 40 minutes to get down to the hospital when my wife went into labor. The most stressful 40 minutes of my life. It was visible. The second characteristic is it is progressive. It starts, doesn't it? And it's like, oh, I think it's time. But then it progresses, doesn't it? And it progresses until there is a climactic event, which is, congratulations, Mr. Bergen, you're a father. I'm like, wow, that was so easy. And so it's visible, it's progressive, but it's climactic. Are you with me? Now, the budding of the flower to the fruit of the fig tree is exactly the same. First, you can see it, but then it progresses from a flower to a bud to the fruit to the harvest, and the climax is you get to pick it and eat it. And if you live in that part of the world, it's a delicacy to have figs. So Jesus takes both of these two things, overlays them as a framework of how to understand what he is going to say next. But me being a programmer, I'm going to overlay it in a graph. On this side, we have, ladies, say it with me, intensity. Men, you don't know what we're talking about. But along the bottom, we have what, ladies? Now let's plot it, because we're going to always plot on graphs, aren't we? What happens is, we look at the labor pains. First, there is a pain, and its intensity is low, if you're lucky, I guess. Then as time goes by, the frequency starts to get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, right? But as it gets shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, what happens to the intensity? Higher and higher and higher and higher. So when we look at these signs that Jesus is going to give us that describes how near or what it looks like when this last empire comes, which is his return, when that all happens, here's how we have to frame it. We have to look at what he says in the light of, is there an increase in frequency and an increase in intensity? So that's the framework. Now what Jesus does is he says, listen, I'm going to give you some signs. We can group them by category. There are 5 categories of signs. Here's the first one. The first category deals with what we would call environmental or the natural world. Things that will happen in the world around us environmentally, he connects to being indicators. But how do we have to view this? With an increase in frequency and an increase in intensity. You are going to graduate this masterclass with honors. The first thing he talks about are earthquakes. He says there will be, so in light of before he returns, before that last empire, there will be earthquakes in many places or various places. Now remember, there have always been what? Earthquakes, but we're not looking for earthquakes as the sign. We're looking for an increase in frequency and intensity. That's what we're looking for. Now also, I'll say this up right now before I forget. We are looking for these 5 categories of signs not happening one by themselves, but all happening together. Okay, you with me? There's always been earthquakes. I was just in Pompeii last year, and in Pompeii they had the biggest earthquake. It was an eruption. They had an earthquake first, then it was an eruption with a volcano and wiped them out. They didn't see the sign as the sign to leave, and that's why they didn't survive. And so here we have the ultimate signs to survive. Let's have a look at earthquakes. Time magazine said that the number of known earthquakes and of deadly earthquakes has dramatically increased in the last 100 years or so. Here's a chart that comes from the US Geological Service that plots from the last 100 years and into this new millennia, the earthquakes that are magnitude 5 or greater. When you look at their data, what do you visualize? You see that there are more earthquakes happening of category 5 or higher, or magnitude 5 or higher. We're just looking at the last 100 years. And you can say, well, it's because we have better recording material or instruments, so therefore there's going to be more discovered. Okay, stick with that point. See how that works out of the course of the rest of the program. But can you see that clearly we have seen that there are more earthquakes happening based on their data? The next thing that Jesus refers to in the natural world is he says there will be famines. He literally just says there will be famines. That will be one of the signs. Remember, we're looking for intensity and frequency. But at the same time, there should also be earthquakes having an increase in frequency, an increase in intensity. Do you get what I'm seeing here? We're overlaying all these things, not one in isolation. There's an earthquake in Christchurch. We go, oh, it's the end of the world. No, there needs to be all of these things happening concurrently because there's one climactic event at the end. These are some very shocking and sad statistics. But today the world is experiencing famine, believe it or not, on a scale that we haven't seen in human history because we have more people in human history than ever before. It's insane. There's 24,000 people that are dying every day from hunger according to the United Nations. They're saying that 50 plus million people don't have a meal tonight. You're the lucky ones. You just had something to eat. They say that 900, almost 1 billion people go to bed hungry. I've been in some of the poorest countries in this world. And it's shocking what some of the conditions of life are. And you come back to Australia here for a couple of days and you forget how bad the rest of the world is and you enjoy your convenience. But there's something happening in this world. And this is the worst part. It's not that we don't have money on the planet to solve the problem. It's just that we're selfish to solve it. Then it talks about these cyclones and tsunamis and floods and these water natural environments. Jesus continues and says there will be distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, which is basically describing tsunami-type destruction. I've been collecting Time magazines for many, many years. In fact, 24 years I've been collecting these things. And it's it's insane to see how much of natural disasters occupy the front pages of Time magazine. Just in the last 25 years that I've been doing this. It's phenomenal. But then Jesus goes one step further and he talks about this thing called pestilence. A pestilence is a plague, it's a virus. And he says there will be, with the famines, there will be pestilence and the earthquakes we've already talked about. I'll take you on a quick whirlwind tour since I've been collecting information in my journey. In 2003 is when I first started studying this stuff for real. And it was ironic because as I was reading the text, I looked up and that week or that month, I forget exactly how close it was proximity, on the news there was this big thing called mad cow disease out of the UK. Do you remember that? And I was like, what on earth is a mad cow disease? And it turns out that humans have been feeding cows, the parts of cows to feed the cows. And then humans are eating the cows, or the cows eat the cows and go mad. And so then they say, oh, we better not eat those cows because we might go mad. There's mad cow disease. Then also in 2003, there was a thing called SARS. Do you remember SARS? It was a lot like COVID, but it was called SARS. And then in 2003, and it ran pretty much to 2017, was H5N1, or as it is affectionately known as bird flu. My wife and I were living in Taiwan when this one hit, and they shut the hospital down because we were connected to the hospital there. They put the masks on. We had to keep distance. It was a lot like COVID. Sorry, I triggered some of you. I know. I apologize for that. Then in 2009, there was N1H1, which was known as swine flu. We were also in Taiwan when this one happened. When you go in and out of airports, they'll check your temperature. It was amazing. And then there was MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. Look at the year, 2015 to 2018. And you see the COV after it? It's COVID. It's a part of the COVID family. And that was to 2018. And then in 2018, Africa saw the biggest outbreak of Ebola that's been seen in recent centuries. And you know what's on the next slide, right? Then there was this one. And as I mentioned before, there was this one. And then, thankfully, it didn't become a thing. They all started freaking out about monkeypox in 2022. So there's been some interesting developments in the pestilence space. These pathogens, these viruses. But remember again, it's supposed to all be connected. There will be earthquakes, there will be famines, there will be pestilence, there will be tsunamis and all these sorts of things. And all of these things, strangely enough, we're seeing more and more concurrently instead of one by one over the centuries. Here's a data. This is an excellent website. It's a non-profit organization called Our World in Data. It's free. You can go to it. And you can type in anything. There's all these different ways to graph data. This is their chart that shows globally reported natural disasters by type from 1970 to 2022. And this is all disasters, so I haven't broken it down to floods or famines or whatever it is, but it's all disasters. Can you notice that there's a general trajectory here? If this was a stock market chart, you would be buying because you know that it's going to go up. And yet this is the disaster that's happening in our world. It's increasing. So in the first category, we see a lot of different indications within this natural category of signs. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, he's saying this 2,000 years ago, he says, when it's going to be close, you're going to start feeling like birth pains. You're going to start seeing this stuff happen more and more and more and more often. Basically, the world's falling to pieces in the environmental space. But he continues and says there's a second category, political. So not only should you be seeing this stuff happening in the natural world, there should also concurrently, in the same frequency and intensity, be seeing these things in the political world. This is what he says. He says, you will hear of what? Wars. You will also hear of rumors of wars. I want to show you one of the most depressing charts or graphs that I think we could possibly show as the human species. You ready for it? Every color that's not gray is an area on the planet that has a conflict tonight. If you're in one of those parts, or your family is in one of those parts, they're in conflict tonight. And who are they in conflict with? Some alien species or something? No, with fellow humans. If this continues, we will be in what they're calling already, they're calling it technically World War III. They're already saying that. I'm not freaking anybody out here. But we will be in a World War III if we continue much more with this. This is a sad, sad reality. And yet, this rabbi 2,000 years ago says, listen, it's not going to get better before it gets better. He continues on and says this. He says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. If the nations and nations are fighting, and the kingdom and kingdoms are fighting, what peace is there? There's none. And this is what this rabbi 2,000 years is saying. He's saying, it's not going to be peaceful. There's going to be attempts. Remember, they're going to try and marry and create alliances and try and bring back united parts of the world, and it's all going to be, they're going to attempt to do this, but it's not going to happen. We're incapable of it. We've had many, many, many millennia trying to be peaceful. We don't have a good record of it. The same Rabbi Jesus speaks to his disciple John in the book of Revelation. We talked about that last night a little bit. And in that picture, he says to John, he says, listen, right before this last empire comes, I like my flowers, this become the last empire, but this last empire, when it comes, right before that, what's he say? The nations were angry. Do you know, I'm not pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I couldn't care less. They're Americans. I'm Australian. I love living in Australia. If you're an American, I'm so sorry. But the crazy thing is, I was shocked that he started going after Canada. And then not just Canada, but what's that other place? The Greenland. What? Have you met a Canadian before? Oh yeah, they're really scary. The nations are messed up. Well, a nation is messed up. It's crazy. The world is in a crazy state right now. And Jesus made it very clear. You don't have to believe that he knows what he's talking about, but he seems to be getting pretty good with his predictions. He's saying right before this time comes, it is going to be very, very unpeaceful. In fact, I think you're probably aware of this. We live in a world that has an incredible amount of nuclear power. They say there's 27,000 bombs around the world right now. There has been for a very long time. But the scariest part of this is, I don't know if you've been reading the news for the last couple of years with the war that's happening in Ukraine and Russia, but have you read how there's been conversations and discussion about a localized nuclear option? In the mainstream media, not conspiracy stuff. We're living in uncertain times once again. And the sad reality with war is that we spend more per hour on war, and I say we as humans, that in 1 hour what we're spending on war could have solved half of the famine problems around the world, could have provided water sanitation to half of the world. It's incredible. And notice this chart. This is showing, the blue line is the population of the world up to the year 2000, and the red line is showing the deaths related to war. Isn't that insane? As our population is exploding, so is our death rates related to war. I would think that if you look at the history of this is probably the worst time to live in terms of peace, and yet this is supposed to be the most sophisticated era in humans' development. This is supposed to be the time that we've got all this technology. Now with AI technology, we're going to solve the peace problem, and yet we're the most violent that humans have ever been. It's incredible. Somebody seems to know what he was talking about. The third category is in the social world. Jesus continues on talking to his rabbis, talking about the signs and indications of what it's going to be like back down here. He says, listen, there's going to be a time that there will be lawlessness. Lawlessness is the desire for removing morality, removing law. And he says, because that desire will abound, most people are going to be going down this path. He says, the love of many will grow cold towards each other, which makes sense because that's why we're going to war and wiping each other out. But notice how he puts it with his friend Paul. Paul saw Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Paul writes it this way, describing the same scene. He says, "Know this, that in the last days," so this is the time between where we are to where it's going to end with that last empire, "that perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers," and get this, "disobedient to" what? Parents. You see, it seems like every other generation in human history never had that problem. But now we live in a world where I have seen with my own eyes on trains where adults are terrified of 12-year-olds on the trains. I read a report, I was in Perth recently, and there was a report in the Mail there of how, I think she was 93-year-old grandma in her house. There was a 14-year-old that broke in and had his way with her. What kind of world is it that we're living in? And it continues and says that they're unthankful. This is us as humans as we get closer to this last empire. We'll be unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving. It sounds like people who are triggered a lot. People who want to cancel everybody for anything that's different to their own opinion, doesn't it? Like, I don't know, some of you older people in the room, do you see a difference in your lifetime? Because I do, and I'm only 47. People hate people. You didn't say what I said. You don't agree with what I believe. You don't believe in the politics I believe in. And it's like we hate each other. This book said that it's going to get worse. They lack self-control. They're despisers of good. They're traitors, headstrong, and haughty. Doesn't sound good at all. Watch this statistic. This is pretty shocking. This is from the US. The average number of kids or children who are killed by a parent, 500 a year. Could you imagine? Don't imagine. But what kind of person is it that gives birth to a child? And by the way, most of the cases it's their mothers. I mean, I know motherhood's difficult. But what has happened to the world where the person that brought a child and life into the world can take that life? What kind of world are we living in? And by the way, in Australia, it's not that high, but it's 100 plus in Australia per year. It's insane. So it's not just those crazy Americans. I want to show you another thing that's insane. In the 1940s, Reader's Digest, that magazine, I still remember Reader's Digest when I was a kid. I don't think they really exist anymore. It used to be great, get this little book in the mail with plastic wrapped on it. And it always be like a little trinket or something in the thing. You collect them. It was amazing. But anyway, they did a survey in the 1940s, and they wanted to find out what were the top problems that teachers faced in school. And here's the top 7 things. The number one problem in the 1940s with students at school was that they would talk without raising their hand. Any teachers here tonight? Wouldn't you love that to be your top problem in this classroom? Number one problem. Hey, you didn't raise your hand. I'm sorry, miss. I'll raise it next time. Number one problem. Number 2 problem. They were chewing gum in class. Number 3, making noise. Can you believe that? That was number 3 problem in the United States in 1940. Running in the hallway, number 4. Number 5, cutting in line, means pushing in. Unbelievable. How about this one? Dress code. They didn't wear their uniform properly. And the last one was littering. This was the top 7 problems in the education system in the United States in the 1940s. Incredible. Now, I want you to imagine that you were an alien. I'm not a big believer in those things, but let's imagine you're an alien. You live from planet Pluto or something. That's not a planet anymore, is it? They degraded it. But imagine you're from out there somewhere way out. And you come to Earth in the 1940s and you observe the school system and go, oh boy, they've got some problems here. They're talking out of turn, they're chewing gum, making noise, running the hallway, cutting a line, dress. Wow, all right. They get in a little spaceship and they fly away. And then they decide, we're going to come back and check out on Earth again, right? They come back in the 2000s. And this is what they find. The number one problem in school in the 2000s is drug abuse. You think you took a U-turn somewhere near the Milky Way and went to the wrong planet. Second, alcohol abuse in school. Now, you teachers here are going, yeah, dude, I've been dealing with this my whole working career. Something has changed on this planet. Pregnancy, number 3. 4, you can read that. Number 5, you can read that, can't you? This is the school. Something has changed in our society. Number 7, robbery. Number 6, robbery. Number 7, assault in school. I have had the privilege of working with many teachers over the years in many different countries. And there are some places in this world today where the teachers don't want to teach anymore. Personally, I would never want to teach, especially high schools. There is something changing in this world. In fact, here's a book called Saving Childhood, page 19. It says, the average American child, and it's no different for Australians, I don't think it's just their problem, the average American child will spend more time watching TV by the age of 5 than they will spend talking to their father in their lifetime. Something's changing. The world that we're living in today is not the world of only 60, 70, 80 years ago. Something is changing. And remember the prediction that we are going to be unthankful, unloving, we were going to be brutal. Sounds just like what we're reading today. This is Australia. The saddest statistics you'll see in Australia, 1 in 6 boys, 1 in 4 girls, before the age of 18. Something's changing in this world. And at the same time, we're seeing the natural disasters. At the same time, we're seeing those political disasters. You see how it's all sort of happening at the same time for the first time in human history? But there's another category. Jesus goes on and gives us a whole bunch of signs in the religious world and says, watch for these too. Intensity and frequency. That's what he says. He says, there shall arise false Christs. So remember, we're here. There's the last empire. We're looking at this time here. Category 1, natural. Category 2, political. Category 3, social. Category 4, religious. There'll be false Christs and false prophets, and they will show great signs and wonders. I have had the bizarre privilege of meeting many prophets in my last 24 years. I've met them in America, I've met them in Taiwan, and I've met them here in Australia and Africa. In fact, I don't think there's a continent I've been to where I haven't met a prophet. And how do I know they're a prophet? Because they came and told me. I'm prophet such and such. I have a prophecy for you. Jesus warns us. Now, I want to be very careful here because Jesus says, there shall arise what kind of Christ and what kind of prophets? False. But the fact that he's saying there shall arise false prophets implies there will be true prophets. The fact that he says there will be false Christ means that there will be a true Christ, right? And that's him. So he's not saying there's none, because the Old Testament is very clear that before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, which is this one here, that many people will receive a gift of prophecy. So it's not that we just disregard anybody saying that. What we do is we put them to the test. Now, I want to introduce you to some Christs that are walking the earth right now. You want to meet them? You bunch of weirdos. You want to meet false Christ? I know, Here's the first one. If you go to Siberia today, you'll meet Siberian Jesus. Please don't go and meet him. He has about 150,000 followers. They live in 150,000 followers, and he lives in the mountains in Siberia, and they've built a village down below, and he comes out every now and then and gives them a speech, and they all go up there and worship him as the reincarnated Jesus, Siberian Jesus. But let's go here. This Jesus has since passed away, but he is originally from South America, and he lived in Florida, and he was Miami Jesus. And the interesting thing with this Jesus is that he claims that he is the sinful Jesus. There was the Jesus who was Jesus of the Bible, but he's the sinful Jesus. And guess what his number was? 666. And so his followers would tattoo themselves with 666 to show their followers. He had 1.5 million followers. Yeah, 1.5 million people, 1.5 million people. Unbelievable. He has since passed away, and they're claiming that his body has resurrected somewhere into another world or another realm. Yeah, very convenient story. But let's not be hard on Miami Jesus, because there's a Jesus in South Africa. This is Jesus, South African Jesus, preaching at his own wedding. And obviously he was talking a long time because everyone fell asleep. But he has a number of followers following him as well. And he believes he has the gospel for our world at this time. But don't be hard on South African Jesus, because there is a Zambian Jesus too. Zambian Jesus is a taxi driver by day. He preaches the gospel to anybody who will listen. And he has 12 disciples. And he has a couple of thousand followers in Zambia. But not to be outdone, there is Tokyo Jesus. Tokyo Jesus was formerly running for mayor of a local province, and he lost the election, and all of a sudden he comes back as Jesus. He has a few thousand followers who think that this man is Jesus Christ. This is funny, but it's the saddest thing I could possibly show you tonight, because these people, in my view of this book, are completely deceived. But, not to be outdone, we have an Australian Jesus. And the amazing thing is, he's from Queensland. But originally born in South Australia. That explains it, doesn't it? No, I'm just kidding. Now, I say this with some level of laughter, but this man was on 7 Spotlight, and he's being interviewed. I've watched the entire interview. It's fascinating. He claims that he has memories of being nailed on the cross. And not just that, but he is found Mary Magdalene, who he is now married to. And they live out somewhere near Kilcoy. Unbelievable. The Bible goes on and says it's not just about these people that think they're Jesus and they actually deceive people to follow him. There's also this thing called secularism, which is the absence of faith. Here's what the Bible says. It says, when Jesus speaking, he says, when the Son of Man comes. So Jesus is saying, you're here, there's the end and the return. He says, when he comes, will he find what? Faith on the earth. Because there's a widespread disbelief in the religious as we get closer to the end. In fact, if we look at it this way, now you don't have to believe this either way. But if you went back, say, 100 to 150 years ago, most people on the planet believed in some kind of God. They believed in some kind of creation story. But after the likes of Charles Darwin and the Enlightenment, as it's called and referred to, we've become so smart that we have no place for God anymore. And that's not to say one's right or wrong at this point, it's just to say that's the facts. I want you to notice, now let me imagine I'm creating my own religion, and I write this book, and I want everyone to become part of my religion. I'm going to try and convince you all by the words of this book to follow me, right? Why would I write this, what I'm going to show you on the screen next, into my book? This is what it says. This is Peter, who is one of Jesus' disciples, who's asking the question, what will be the sign before you return? This is what Jesus tells Peter, and Peter writes it down. He says, knowing this first, that in the last days, so between here and there, in the last days, they, what's the next word, everyone? Willfully forget. What do they forget? That the word of God, the heavens were of old. Hang on, I'll read this way. Knowing this first, that in the last days they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water in the water. Basically means this, that they willfully forget at the end, in the last days, that there's a creator. Now, if I was writing the book, I'd try and keep that part hush hush. You don't read that part, that's not, no. Just believe it, okay? Believe it. This book goes, no, look, we'll tell you the facts. The fact is, at some point in the future, they're not going to believe this thing. That's remarkable. Today, this is what I studied when I was in uni, when I did sciences, is that we have evolved from this concept and model of Darwinian evolution. I'm not saying you shouldn't believe it or you should believe it. All I'm saying is it's interesting that this thing predicted will move away from this idea of a creator and believe nothing. The Son of Man says, will there be any faith when I show up? Fascinating. That's the 4 categories that he gives. Here's the 5th and last, financial signs. As we get to this climactic point at the end, there'll be environmental signs, there'll be political signs, there'll be in social signs and religious signs and financial signs. But remember, they have to all be working like a woman going into labor. So don't expect, or you shouldn't be looking at, well, when was the last big earthquake? Oh, maybe he's coming now. No. Has there been anything in the political space, religious space, and so on and so on? Now, the financial sign is very easy because we did it last night. Remember we looked at these 3 characters? The dragon, the sea beast, and the land beast. Remember that from Revelation last night? And how that these 3 are coming together to try and create this allegiance model at the end. And do you remember what was the first element of the way that they're going to try and bring this about? That no one may buy or sell except. And last night we looked at those 3 characters, and what we saw was this is the language of a global economic control. It's a picture of that. Now, we said last night, 2,000 years ago was here approximately with John, who wrote Revelation, and he's looking down to this point. And by the way, it was the Jesus fellow that gave John this picture to write in Revelation. These words are from Jesus in the story. So the same Jesus is describing, hey, look for the environmental signs, look for the political signs, look for the religious signs, look for the social signs. That same Jesus fellow says to John, hey, by the way, as you get down there, there's going to be a financial issue as well, a financial sign. What's the sign? Global economic control. Now, as we said last night, there has been never a time in this whole 2,000 years since it was written that that was possible. Until the beginning of 2020. Again, I'm not setting dates. But remember last night we saw that for the first time in human history, 130 countries on the planet are all exploring a controllable currency system. At the same time, we have false Christs, and there'll be more. At the same time, we have an increase in the natural disasters. At the same time, the social world is falling to pieces. And so it looks like the time between here and here is getting extremely close. But I'm not setting dates because he doesn't tell us to set a date. In fact, he says, no man or woman knows the hour. But then he says, but learn the parable of the fig tree. You can see as it's developing to the fruit and when it's going to be ripe, so too when you see these things happen, know too that it is near. So we have 5 signs. The question we're answering tonight is, how near is this last empire? Natural, political, social, religious, and financial. For the first time in human history, we're seeing every one of these categories happening concurrently. No, we're not there yet. Don't leave here going, oh, it's going to happen tomorrow. It's not. There's still more to come. But we are closer now in 2025 than has ever been possible in human history. It's incredible. But the big question that the skeptic will ask is, so what? There's always been these things and there will always be forever. Maybe you're right. But don't forget there's 1,817 predictions in the Bible. And so far, the track record we've looked at has been pretty impressive. Is it possible that this may also be impressive as well? I'm leaning towards that being true. So here's what Jesus ends with in this discussion. He says, when you see all these things, these are the things we just looked at, these 5 categories of things. He says, look, when you see all these things, know that it is at the doors. The it is the answer to the question. What was the question? When will these things happen? What will be the sign of your return and the end of the world? He says, when you see all these things, know that it, last empire, will be at the door. Remember the question? What will be the sign? So we go back to where we finish where we started in our first session. Remember that dream? Nebuchadnezzar had that big metal man and he saw that rock coming and hit that statue, and then the rock became a great mountain. We went through all those elements in the previous session. But the point of the dream is not all these different elements and time. The point of the dream was the rock or the stone. That's the climax. That is what is at the door. And this is how Daniel put it in the final verses that he gave to King Nebuchadnezzar. He said, in the days of these kings, that's those divided Europe, the 10 divisions of Europe. He says, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. That's the last empire. Some people think, is it going to be China? That was a Trump impersonation. China. Or is it going to be the US? I have news for all of you. It's neither. Like that? Neither. It's his last empire is God's. And it says, it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Remember that prophecy once again. In the days of these kings, this is divided Europe we're talking about here. We're waiting for that last empire. That is the big thing. This is the timeline that we're looking at from Daniel. And then this Jesus fellow gives us the filler in this last part of the picture. And the question that we will end with tonight is, what will this last empire be like? There's a few clues here. The same Jesus that gave all that, what seemed like bad news, comes back to John back here in Revelation and says, listen, that last empire will be a time when God will wipe away what? Every single tear. Some of you have had tears today. Maybe it was pain in your knees or your bones or your cancer that you're facing. Maybe it's your chronic depression. Maybe you've lost a loved one. But we've all had too many tears, haven't we? And my wife and I were talking this afternoon as we're driving, and she said, why don't you ever cry when you're happy? Where's your tears of joy? I don't know. I'm incapable of crying when I'm happy. Some of you have tears of joy, but most of you have tears of misery. And this promises that this last empire, there'll be no more tears in their eyes. There shall be no more, what's this one, everyone? Oh, wouldn't that be a good day? There's too many loved ones that we have had to stand there and say our final goodbyes to, wondering what's happened to them. Will we see them again, or is that it? Is that the end? There'll be no more sorrow, no more crying, and there'll be no more pain. Why? Because everything that was before it, if this is our last empire, everything before it is former. And the former things, it says, are passed away. Then it says, he who sat on the throne, which is referring to Jesus in the passage, he says, behold, I'm making everything new. Now, you can go, well, that sounds really nice and convenient, Robbie. I'm so glad you presented that happy little note, but I'm just not interested because I think it's all a load of rubbish and fiction. Hey, congratulations, you're a thinker. I've been there. That's what I've been doing for 24 years in my faith experiment. Because here's the thing. Don't take my word for this stuff. That's what this 2,000-year-old compilation of book, or at least the most recent part's 2,000 years. The old part's even older than that. That's what it claims. But you need to experiment with it. The most amazing thing with this book is it doesn't expect you to have dumb faith. It expects you to have experimental faith. And so this book claims that this last empire is the place where it doesn't tell you if you're going to have a harp. It doesn't tell you if you're going to have a mansion. Some people think it says mansions. Others say it's a room in a dorm room or something. It doesn't tell you if you'll have a car. It It doesn't tell you if you have a rocket ship, or it doesn't tell you any of that stuff. All it tells you is the thing that matters the most to you today is your pain. It takes care of it. And if that's taken care of, you're going to enjoy the rest of the time. Daniel says, listen, the great God has shown the king what shall come to pass in the future. The dream is what? That's Daniel claiming, not me. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. We go back to these statistics. If you were a betting person and you have seen a 2,600-year prediction fulfill 6 of the 7 elements in succession, in order, in characteristic, and the only one left from where you are standing is this last empire, what are you prepared to bet that's going to happen? Well, I'm talking to that now, aren't I? That number 7 is going to happen. What are you prepared to bet? Someone said it. You're betting your life. One way or the other. You walk out of here and go, there's a lot of rubbish. You're betting your life that that's wrong. You walk out and you go, I believe it. You're betting your life that that's right. But either way, you're betting. So according to this Jesus fellow, which we'll look at in more detail tomorrow night, what should our response and reaction be when we're standing here, we're seeing these things in light of what he's saying will come soon? This is what he says. He says, no, now when these things begin to take place, this is the concurrency of these 5 categories, this concurrency, this intensity, this frequency. When this starts to take place, he says, stand up, lift up your head. And that language, by the way, in ancient Hebrew is like victorious. Don't be all hunched over and hiding in gloom and doom. This is it, according to the biblical account. This is the final finale. This is the end game. From one perspective, we'll look at the other perspective later on in the program. Why are we lifting up our heads? Why are we standing up like something good's about to happen? Why? Because he says, because your deliverance is approaching. No more tears is approaching. No more pain is approaching. No more sorrow, no more death. It's all approaching. I don't know about you, but I am siding on the side that this is probably a pretty safe bet.